On the quiet afternoon of August 7th, 2016, two locals were out for a casual walk along a secluded rural track near the small town of Scone, in New South Wales. But as the pair made their way through the countryside, something caught their attention just off the side of the dirt road. Tucked within the undergrowth, only a few feet from where vehicles might occasionally pass, was a strange patch of disturbed earth. Soon after, forensic investigators were deployed to the scene to carry out a detailed examination. Their worst fears were confirmed. Shallow grave belonged to Carly McBride. Carly McBride was born on April 14, 1983, to her loving parents, Steve McBride and Lorraine Williams. From a young age, Carly was known for her bright, warm personality, as the type of person who made an impression wherever she went. In 2013, seeking to turn a corner in her life, Carly made the courageous decision to check into a rehabilitation center. This step was motivated by her desire to overcome a dependency issue that had affected her life for some time. Her goal was to recover not just for herself, but for the sake of her children, who were her biggest motivation. During her time at the center, Carly met a man named Sale Kenneth Newson. At first, their connection was casual, a friendship forged through shared experiences and long conversations. Over time, however, their bond deepened, eventually developing into a romantic relationship. By August of 2014, Carly and Sale were spending most of their days together. They were often seen around town, sometimes smiling, sometimes mid-argument, like many couples who are still getting used to the rhythm of a shared life. Although they had their disagreements, to outsiders, they appeared to be in a committed and supportive relationship. Then came September 30th, 2014, a day that would change everything. That morning, Sale drove Carly to Muswellbrook, a town located approximately 90 minutes from Belmont. The reason for the trip was simple. Carly wanted to visit her daughter Cadence, who was living there with her father, Andrew Easton, Carly's former partner. Carly was planning to spend a few hours with her little girl, a short but meaningful visit. According to reports, she entered Andrew's home around 12:30 p.m. Sale, as agreed, did not accompany her inside and planned to return later in the afternoon to pick her up. However, when Sale came back to the house to collect Carly around 4:30 p.m., she was nowhere to be found. Andrew Easton told Sale that Carly had left the house earlier, following an argument between the two of them. He claimed she had walked off on foot, saying she was heading toward the nearby McDonald's, a fast food restaurant located roughly a mile away. Worried, Sale tried calling Carly's phone several times, but all of his attempts went unanswered. He suggested that her phone might have died, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Hoping she had followed through with her plan to visit McDonald's, he drove in that direction, scanning the sidewalks, storefronts, and surrounding areas along the way. He looked everywhere he could think of, even circling nearby streets, but there was no sign of Carly. That evening, when Carly failed to return to her home in Belmont, a return she had promised to make, Sale reported her disappearance to the police. Authorities quickly took his reports seriously and began gathering information about her last known movements. During the initial investigation, detectives interviewed Sale and asked him to recount the events of that afternoon. He maintained that he had returned at the agreed-upon time, only to learn from Andrew Easton that Carly had already left, walking away from the home alone several hours earlier. Easton's version of events placed him as the last known person to see Carly that day. However, there were no other witnesses who could confirm seeing her leave the residence. No neighbors reported seeing her on the street, and no passers-by recalled spotting a woman matching her description walking toward the McDonald's. Making matters more complicated was the fact that there were no security cameras near Andrew Easton's property. This lack of surveillance footage meant investigators had no visual confirmation of Carly leaving the house, nor any indication of which direction she might have gone, if she had left on foot, as claimed. Without footage, eyewitnesses, or a clear trail, the case quickly became far more challenging. In the days that followed, police expanded their search. Officers combed through fields and wooded areas behind nearby housing developments, hoping to uncover any item or clue that might point to Carly's whereabouts. Despite their efforts, nothing of significance was discovered. With each passing day, Carly's disappearance became more mysterious and more troubling. Her family and friends launched public appeals, urging anyone who might have seen something, no matter how small, to come forward. The community in Muswellbrook rallied to support the search efforts, distributing flyers and sharing information across social media. Authorities, too, made repeated requests for help. They emphasized that even the smallest detail might prove critical to solving the case. Investigators asked members of the public to contact the police department if they had seen Carly that day or noticed anything unusual in the area. After securing a search warrant, authorities moved forward with one of the most critical early steps in the investigation: a detailed examination of the home where Carly McBride was last seen. The house in question belonged to Andrew Easton, Carly's former partner and the father of her young daughter. A team of police officers arrived on the scene with a clear purpose: to search thoroughly for any trace of the missing 31-year-old mother. They inspected common areas, bedrooms, and outdoor spaces, looking for anything out of place. Items Carly may have left behind, evidence of a struggle, or digital devices that could hold communication records. Despite their careful and comprehensive efforts, police were unable to find any physical evidence that directly explained Carly's sudden disappearance. However, while the search didn't yield tangible proof within the home, the investigative team soon stumbled upon something that raised serious concerns, something they hadn't expected. Carly's Facebook account had been deactivated just a few hours after she vanished. What was even more suspicious was the timing of this action. Her account was deleted before the missing persons report was officially filed with the police. This raised red flags among detectives and posed a host of new questions. To dive deeper into the matter, law enforcement in New South Wales reached out to international authorities for assistance. They contacted the U.S. Department of Justice, requesting cooperation to access Facebook's internal records. Since Facebook's headquarters and data infrastructure are based in Menlo Park, California, the help of American officials was required to obtain the technical data, particularly account deletion logs, IP activity, and account ownership details. Sergeant Wright, one of the officers closely involved in the case, emphasized that Carly's Facebook contacts might also prove useful. In the weeks that followed, police launched an extensive and far-reaching search operation. Their efforts included the deployment of canine units, aerial reconnaissance, and officers on trail bikes scouring remote terrain. Despite the thoroughness of the operation, no new leads were discovered. Carly had vanished without leaving behind any digital or physical trail. Her phone remained off. Her email and social media accounts were inactive. No purchases were made on her bank cards, and there were no withdrawals or transactions of any kind. The complete silence, both digital and real world, became increasingly ominous. Investigators began to face a heartbreaking reality: the possibility that Carly McBride may no longer be alive. 9 months had now passed since the day Carly went missing. Her parents continued to live in a state of limbo, holding out hope but grappling with the painful silence. They remained deeply involved in the search, working alongside police and volunteers, determined not to let the public forget Carly's name or story. During this time, the investigation was joined by Detective Inspector Timothy Seymour, a seasoned investigator who brought fresh eyes and renewed determination to the case. Inspector Seymour quickly became a key figure in the ongoing investigation. He acknowledged the tireless efforts of his fellow officers, stating that police had followed every possible lead since Carly's disappearance. With no solid leads and a case growing colder by the day, police were relying more than ever on community engagement and public memory. The story of Carly McBride, a mother, daughter, and friend, still carried weight in the hearts of many, and those closest to her continued to fight for answers. But for investigators, and for the community at large, the mission remains clear. Carly must not be forgotten. The search for the truth will continue, for however long it takes. When investigators were unable to establish a direct connection between Carly McBride's sudden disappearance and her former partner, Andrew Easton, their focus began to shift in another direction, towards someone much closer to Carly in the months leading up to that fateful day. That person was Sale Kenneth Newson, the man Carly had been romantically involved with shortly before she went missing. During the course of the investigation, detectives began to uncover details about Carly and Sale's relationship that complicated the narrative he had initially presented to both the public and the authorities. On the surface, the couple had seemed relatively happy. They were often seen together, and Sale had made public efforts to support the search for Carly, but behind closed doors, things weren't quite as harmonious as they appeared. Police interviews and witness statements began to paint a different picture. Friends and family of Carly noted that her relationship with Sale was frequently turbulent. Sale was said to be intensely jealous, and that jealousy had reportedly caused several heated arguments between the couple. Despite the relationship being relatively new, It had only begun in earnest in August 2014. Sale often spoke as though he were deeply attached to Carly. In conversations with friends and even during interviews, he claimed that Carly was the first woman he had truly fallen in love with in over 14 years. In the immediate aftermath of Carly's disappearance, Sale appeared visibly shaken and distressed. He was vocal in his search efforts. He offered financial rewards and personally visited homes near where Carly had last been seen, knocking on doors and asking if anyone had witnessed anything unusual. His actions, at least outwardly, suggested a man grieving a significant loss and determined to find the woman he loved. However, as time passed, a contradiction emerged between his public persona and his private behavior. Investigators discovered that while Sale was presenting himself as a heartbroken partner, he had, in fact, begun pursuing romantic relationships with other women almost immediately after Carly vanished. While it wasn't illegal or even necessarily suspicious for someone to move on quickly, the contrast between his actions and his public statements called into question the sincerity of his emotions and the accuracy of the narrative he had provided to police. Further scrutiny revealed that Sale and Carly had argued just 2 days before she went missing. According to sources close to the investigation, the argument was sparked by Facebook messages Carly had allegedly received from other men, a point that particularly upset Sale. Detectives took note of this conflict, as it revealed potential tension that may have preceded her disappearance. The investigators needed more than patterns of behavior or inconsistencies in Sale's story. They needed direct evidence linking him to a crime, if one had occurred. Then, in April 2015, almost 7 months after Carly vanished, law enforcement conducted searches at 3 separate properties. One was located in Muswell Brook, the town where Carly was last seen. The other 2 were in the nearby community of Scone, roughly 15 miles away. The search team seized 3 firearms and took a 24-year-old man named James Caneen into custody. The mention of James Caneen, who had not previously been identified in the investigation, left many wondering whether he might be relevant down the line. Despite the exhaustive investigation, the months continued to drag on with no major breakthroughs. New interviews were conducted, yet the mystery of what happened to Carly remained unsolved. 2 full years passed without closure. Then on the afternoon of August 7, 2016, 2 local pedestrians were walking along a quiet rural track in the countryside near Scone when they noticed something unusual in the bushland just off the road. What they had discovered appeared to be a shallow grave, only a few feet from where vehicles occasionally passed. The discovery was reported to local authorities immediately, and police quickly secured the scene. Forensic experts were brought in to examine, and within days, their suspicions were confirmed. The shallow grave belonged to Carly McBride. The police chose not to make the discovery public right away. Their decision to delay was strategic. They hoped that keeping the information private for a short time might give them an opportunity to gather fresh evidence or potentially monitor the behavior of persons of interest who might react to the discovery. Despite the detections of Carly, police declined to name any suspects publicly. For 10 long months following the discovery of Carly McBride's remains, law enforcement officials continued their diligent work behind the scenes. Investigators combed through digital records, phone data, timelines, and witness accounts, searching for the evidence needed to finally take decisive legal action. Their patience and persistence ultimately led to a major development. On June 19, 2017, police officers formally executed an arrest warrant for Sale Newson. He was taken into custody and transported to a nearby police station for questioning. After nearly 3 years of uncertainty, the man who had once claimed to love Carly, who had joined in public searches and campaigns for her return, was now at the center of the criminal investigation. Despite being arrested, Sale Newson denied any involvement in Carly McBride's death. He maintained his innocence throughout his interviews and initial hearings, insisting he had no knowledge of what happened to her after she left her ex-partner's home in Muswell Brook. However, Newson was not the only individual to face legal consequences. Authorities also charged a second person, 26-year-old James Caneen, the man previously arrested in 2015 during a separate investigation. Police now believed Caneen played a supporting role in the case. Specifically, they alleged he had helped Newson conceal Carly. While the exact nature of his involvement was still being investigated, prosecutors argued that Caneen's actions had helped delay the discovery of the truth. Interestingly, all 3 individuals, Carly, Sale Newson, and James Caneen, had a shared connection. They had all met while attending the same rehabilitation center. Though each left the facility at different times and under different circumstances, they remained in contact after their departures. The relationships among them formed a complex web that detectives now had to unravel in order to determine motives, opportunities, and timelines. In August 2018, more than 4 years after Carly was last seen alive, the trial of Sale Newson officially began. Due to the complicated nature of the case and the lack of direct forensic evidence, the trial process extended over several years. Much of the prosecution's argument was based on circumstantial evidence, requiring careful presentation to create a cohesive and convincing narrative for the jury. Prosecutors alleged that Carly had met with Sale shortly after leaving Andrew Easton's home in Muswellbrook. It was during this meeting, they claimed, that an altercation occurred. They believed Sale physically assaulted Carly and later sought help from Canine to hide what had happened. While there were no eyewitnesses or security camera footage of the alleged event, investigators presented a series of clues that, when connected, suggested a disturbing chain of events. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence was discovered during a search of Newson's home. Hidden in a shoebox underneath his bed was a folded map. The map had circles drawn around several key towns, including Muswellbrook and Scone, the same general area where Carly's remains were later found. Investigators took this as a potentially significant clue. On the map, handwritten numbers 1, 2, and 3 marked locations just outside Muswellbrook. These cameras track vehicles entering and exiting specific areas, and their inclusion on the map suggested someone had been planning movements with surveillance in mind. Another disturbing detail emerged from Carly's recovered items. The clothing matched exactly what she had been wearing on the day she disappeared. Adding to this, neither her purse nor her mobile phone was ever recovered, despite extensive searches. Investigators believed that these items had been intentionally disposed of to limit digital tracking and delay the investigation. Further scrutiny of Sale Newson's phone revealed suspicious behavior. Specifically, his location services, typically used by apps and devices to track movements, had been manually turned off and later reactivated. The time period during which these settings were disabled spanned from September 18th to October 2nd, 2014, the critical days surrounding Carly's disappearance. Perhaps one of the most unsettling discoveries was tied to a photo used in the early stages of the missing person campaign. After Carly disappeared, a photo of her, one that had been taken by Newson during their drive to Muswellbrook, was used on flyers and social media to raise awareness. But during the trial, digital forensics experts testified that the photo had been edited and cropped before Carly had even been reported missing. And then there was one final, deeply personal detail that stood out during the trial. Not long after the discovery of Carly's remains in 2016, Sale Newson made an unexpected phone call to Carly's father, Steve. The communication occurred just as the family was being forced to confront the painful reality of Carly's fate, and some interpreted it as a manipulative attempt to manage perception or emotions. When the search for Carly McBride first began, Sale Newson quickly stepped into the public eye, portraying himself as a heartbroken man, desperately searching for the woman he loved. As part of that image, he publicly offered a $20,000 reward for any information that might lead to Carly's return. At first glance, it appeared to be a generous and hopeful gesture. However, as investigators began digging into his financial records, they discovered a troubling contradiction. Newson's bank account was nearly empty. This led detectives to suspect that the offer had never been genuine. Instead, they believed it was a calculated move. One made because Newson was confident no one would ever be able to claim it. To police, it looked more like a performative act, intended to draw attention away from himself and build a narrative of a grieving partner who had nothing to hide. In fact, Newson's involvement in the investigation went far beyond what many considered normal. From the very beginning, he inserted himself into every stage of the search operation. On the surface, it might have seemed like the actions of someone desperate for answers. But the deeper detectives looked, the more it appeared he was trying to steer the investigation, not to help, but to control it. During the time when search parties, including volunteers and emergency responders, were distributing missing persons flyers and combing the town of Muswellbrook for any sign of Carly, Newson was elsewhere. He was in Sydney, sending messages to friends about his flashy lifestyle. In one such message, he bragged about driving an Audi R8, a luxury sports car that seemed far removed from the grief-stricken persona he displayed in front of the cameras. One of the most disturbing moments came when Newson spoke to Carly's father, Steve McBride. In conversation, He confidently described the exact area where Carly had eventually been found, a rural location near Scone. He claimed to know the area like the back of my hand, but at that time, the location of the real crime scene had not yet been disclosed to the public. In fact, Newson had only seen footage from a fake crime scene staged by investigators in an attempt to provoke a reaction from suspects. The confidence with which he spoke about the region raised serious red flags for detectives. As the investigation deepened, the evidence, though circumstantial, began to build a consistent narrative. Newson's internet history revealed that he had searched for information on how to delete a Facebook account. While his own profile remained active, Carly's Facebook account had been deleted just hours after she went missing. Police believed this was not a coincidence. Investigators concluded that someone, possibly Newson, had intentionally erased her digital presence to obscure communications that might have shed light on her disappearance. Like assembling a puzzle, the prosecution used each detail to fill in gaps. Eventually, the collective weight of the evidence made it increasingly difficult to believe any other explanation. One of the prosecution's strongest points came from Carly's clothing. When her were discovered in 2016, she was still wearing the same outfit she had been seen in on the day she disappeared. This indicated that whatever happened to her had occurred shortly after she left her ex-partner's home. The judge ultimately concluded that the motive behind Carly's death was rooted in jealousy. When Newson picked her up in Muswellbrook, he likely expected she had been spending time with her daughter, as planned. But instead, he discovered that Carly had spent approximately 90 minutes alone with her former partner. Though her daughter had not been present during that time, Newson's reaction was allegedly one of intense anger and possessiveness. It was believed that this confrontation ended in a violent, spontaneous outburst that resulted in Carly's death. After years of investigation, court proceedings, and emotional testimony, justice was finally delivered. In December 2021, nearly 7 years after Newson reported Carly missing, a jury found him guilty of her death. Sale Newson, who was 43 years old at the time, was sentenced to 27 years in prison. Even in the face of the guilty verdict, Newson continued to maintain his innocence. Addressing the court after sentencing, he stood before the judge and said, "Your Honor, I'm innocent. From the day I reported Carly missing to this very day, I've been compliant with police, the courts, the jails, everything. I've been found guilty of a crime that I did not commit. Someone out there has committed this crime, and it wasn't me. I now have a big struggle ahead of me to try and clear my name." But the case didn't end with him. James Canine, the man who investigators believed had helped Newson hide Carly, also faced charges. Like Newson, he denied any wrongdoing. However, in July 2022, a jury found him guilty. The court determined that Canine had lied during 3 separate police interviews to provide a false alibi for Newson and had deleted key data from his phone to cover their tracks. In November, 31-year-old James Canine was sentenced to 7.5 years in prison. He was given a non-parole period of 4 years. Early in the morning, firefighter George Tiafe had just finished a tiring 24-hour shift at the fire station. Exhausted but looking forward to spending time with his daughter, he drove to his grandmother's house to pick up 8-year-old Madison. On their way home, Madison suddenly remembered that she had forgotten something important back at her mother's apartment. As they drew closer to the townhouse, a feeling of unease washed over him. His chest grew heavy as he stepped inside, and in that moment, his world fell apart. There, on the living room floor, lay Shauna's. Her face was barely recognizable, bruised, bloodied, and disfigured by unimaginable violence. Shauna Ann Castleton was born on March 13, 1966, in Salt Lake City, Utah, to her loving parents, William and Nancy Castleton. Just 2 years later, in 1980, the Castletons packed up once again and headed further south, this time to Northern Virginia. There, Shauna began a new stage in her education, first in middle school and then in high school. At each new place, Shauna quickly made friends and fell into a comfortable groove, proving that a kind heart and a sunny demeanor can ease even the most dramatic transitions. For someone as enthusiastic, charming, and full of life as Shauna, Las Vegas was the perfect place to call home. So, in 1994, when Shauna was 28, she made the decision to move to this bustling city, a place where there's a rich blend of opportunity, entertainment, and the chance for a fresh start. So it wasn't long before she decided to become a cocktail waitress at a glamorous, newly opened casino on the Strip. She quickly became a favorite with both the customers and her colleagues, who fell under the spell of her kindness, her generous spirit, and her ability to make every guest feel special. About a year after starting her new job, Shona's path crossed with a man who seemed destined to be a permanent fixture in her life. His name was George Tiffy, a tall, strong man with a fit, athletic build, a warm and charming smile, and a calm confidence that drew Shona toward him. George was a firefighter with the Las Vegas Fire Department, a man whose calling was to save lives and protect his community. From their very first meeting, a passionate connection blossomed between them, a bond forged by understanding, loyalty, and deep affection. Shona fell in love with George, and to her, it truly felt as if he was the person she had been waiting for all her life. George was not just physically attractive. He was a man with a kind heart, a strong moral compass, and a generous spirit. Someone who made Shona feel valued, supported, and appreciated. Just a year after their first meeting, Shona and George celebrated a momentous event, the birth of their beautiful daughter, Madison. George showered his two girls with love and care, and Shona, now a mother, glowed with happiness and a deep sense of purpose. Because both Shona and George frequently had to work nights due to their respective schedules, Madison often stayed at her grandmother's home while her parents were busy. When Madison turned 3, in March 2006, George and Shona decided to make their relationship official by tying the knot in a wedding ceremony filled with love, happiness, and promises for the future. The first few years after their wedding seemed picture-perfect, a strong marriage forged by loyalty, understanding, passion, and shared goals. But, unfortunately, happiness is not always destined to last. The financial crisis of 2008 dealt a heavy blow to many families across the country, and George and Shona were no exception. This dramatic change in their financial situation placed immense stress upon their marriage. George, wrestling with financial pressures and growing worries, began to withdraw, and his demeanor slowly started to transform, turning him into a person less recognizable to Shona. Once, George crossed a boundary that Shona could not ignore, a moment that cut deep into their marriage and their ability to trust each other. While Shona was in the process of getting ready for work, George turned to her and called her a woman of ill repute, and he chose to do this in front of their young daughter, Madison. This moment, in which he openly disrespected her in the presence of their child, left a permanent scar on their family's happiness. In reality, George was wrestling with his own struggles, his growing financial worries, and a growing feeling of inadequacy stemming from the fact that Shona was now the main breadwinner in their household. This reversal in roles gnawed at his confidence and made him feel less a man in his own home. For this very reason, George began to control how Shona spent their money, much of which Shona had earned through her own hard work and diligence. With each new month and year after the financial crisis, these problems only seemed to grow, adding further weight to their struggles. As if in a silent form of protest against his wife's growing independence, George made a decision to befriend a homeless drifter and hired him to do some yard work, without even consulting her first. Shona was worried about their safety, especially when this unknown person was frequently on their property while George was away. Often, Shona was home alone with Madison, and the man's presence made her feel vulnerable and unsettled. The growing chaos made her feel powerless and sad, yet Shona kept trying to hold everything together for the sake of their family, until there was no more strength left to endure the growing humiliations. Finally, in April 2012, Shona made a courageous decision to leave. She chose peace and stability for herself and her daughter, trusting that a new future was still possible. Shona was a strong woman, someone who excelled at her job, successfully adapted to a new routine, and made sure that little Madison wanted for nothing. The two of them settled into their new city apartment in suburban Summerlin, Nevada, just 30 minutes away from her workplace. Though Shona had lost her marriage, she still had Madison, the greatest blessing of her life, and a rewarding career to pursue. One evening in early September, after finishing her casino shift as usual, Shona made her way back home. The moment she stepped inside their new residence, a rush of disbelief washed over her. Something was not quite right. It was immediately clear someone had been there in her absence. Surprisingly, it wasn't a typical burglary. None of her valuable belongings were gone, except for her wedding ring, a symbol of promises made and promises broken. Instead, the intruder had left something bizarre in its place. A pair of men's boxer shorts, in a small size. At that moment, perhaps due to overwhelm, disbelief, or a lingering hope for normalcy, Shona decided to let it be. A decision that would weigh upon her mind in the months to come. Early on the morning of September 29, 2012, a dramatic chain of events began to unfold. Events that would shock a community and forever alter the lives of those involved. At approximately 3 a.m., surveillance cameras in the casino captured the moment 46-year-old Shona Toffee finished her long overnight shift and walked toward the parking lot. Shona, a devoted mother and a hard-working woman, slipped into her car and began the 30-minute drive back home to suburban Summerlin, a quiet neighborhood where many families chose to raise their children, far away from the chaos of the Las Vegas Strip. Tragically, Shona would not make it safely to her bed that night. Shortly after parking her car in the garage and making her way up toward her townhouse, something awful happened. Shona was attacked right on the stairwell outside her home. The attack was so severe that Shona fell to the floor and was left there, unable to move or call for help. It was not until nearly 6 hours later, at approximately 9 a.m., that Shona's was discovered under dramatic and heartbreaking circumstances. George Toffee, Shona's estranged husband, finished his 24-hour shift at the fire station and then went to his mother's home to pick up their 8-year-old daughter, Madison. The little girl was supposed to spend the day with her father, but just as they were preparing to leave, Madison realized that she had forgotten something at her mother's townhouse, a small but cherished item. So George decided to make a brief stop by Shona's place to retrieve it. As George turned down their street, he noticed from a distance that the garage door was not locked, which seemed unusual. Nevertheless, he and Madison entered the residence together, a moment that would forever be seared into their memories, and stumbled upon Shona's on the living room floor. In shock and disbelief, George rushed his daughter back outside to protect her from the awful scene. With shaking hands, he called 911 and relayed all the details of what he had found to the emergency dispatcher, unsure of what might come next. At that point, George and Shona had been living separately for several months due to their ongoing divorce process, and he insisted he had no knowledge of anyone who might wish to harm her. When the first paramedics arrived at the scene, it was already much too late to save Shona. According to interviews with neighbors, the attack most likely occurred sometime between 3:30 and 4 in the morning. During that window, a nearby resident said he heard a brief commotion, a few suspicious noises, but did not pay much attention, thinking it might be a domestic dispute or some kind of minor incident. Naturally, the first person who fell under suspicion was Shona's former husband, George Toffee, a man from whom Shona was currently in the process of divorcing. However, investigators soon ruled him out as a suspect when they found that George was at the fire station, surrounded by colleagues, for his 24-hour shift. A strong alibi that cleared him from any suspicion of wrongdoing. This left the case a puzzling mystery for both the police and the community. Some, especially Shona's sister Paula, remained unconvinced. In Paula's opinion, George was the only person who could possibly harm Shona, and she remained firm in her conviction, disregarding the facts that supported his alibi. Meanwhile, detectives kept all their options open and investigated other suspects. The case, which initially seemed perplexing and sad, soon began to gain momentum. Just 48 hours after Shona's death, the police received a phone call from a chance eyewitness, someone whose testimony would enable them to solve this puzzling case in record time. The caller was a man named William Panks, but many knew him simply as Big Will. William had been a fixture in Las Vegas for many years and was well known as a maintenance expert who kept numerous apartment buildings in proper condition. Shortly before this phone call, William had received an urgent call from a friend, someone eager to boast about something. A confession or a piece of information that could break the case wide open. This new lead was a turning point for the investigators, sending them down a path toward justice for Shona Toffee and hopefully offering some peace to her family in the wake of their immense tragedy. He was happy. Happy in a way that made him look as if he had just completed some significant mission for which he would soon be rewarded with a large sum of cash. His expression was one of pure satisfaction, a feeling of accomplishment, even a rush of adrenaline. During his story, his friend, meanwhile, was laughing with unmistakable pleasure, as if he had performed a heroic deed, and this filled William, Big Will, with deep resentment and disbelief. This was not something he could celebrate or appreciate in any way. Big Will tried his best to live a righteous, upstanding life under the Lord's guidance, as he often put it. His moral compass was strong. He made it a point to aid those in need, especially people who had stumbled or gone down a difficult path, individuals who had gotten out of prison and were looking for a chance at redemption. This was precisely why the story his friend was openly bragging about struck him as reprehensible and completely unacceptable. This crossed a moral boundary that Big Will could not ignore. It went far beyond the kind of people he was normally willing to help. The following morning, after wrestling with his conscience all night, Will decided it was his civic and moral duty to come forward and report what he knew to the police. At first, his message seemed somewhat implausible to the detectives, almost a wild tale that fell outside the ordinary course of crimes. Nevertheless, the police decided to follow up and see whether there might be a kernel of truth in his words. The man Big Will was worried about was a person named Neil Stevens. Stevens lived in a small, somewhat clandestine spot at the foot of the hills, far away from the glittering city center with its hotels, restaurants, and bustling tourists. Stevens was a former inmate, someone Big Will had been trying to help him find a new path in life, a path toward honesty, stability, and peace. Because William didn't know his friend's exact address, he instead led the police to a nearby grocery store, where Stevens was frequently seen. And by pure coincidence, the detectives stumbled upon their suspect there, on the corner of a side street, quietly minding his own business. The officers proceeded to arrest Stevens due to prohibited substances found in his possession, and transported him to the police station for questioning. The homeless man insisted he hadn't done anything related to Shona Tifi's death. He repeatedly said the police had made a mess by arresting him. He was the wrong person. Detectives, meanwhile, began to doubt their own assumptions. They couldn't see a clear connection between a vagrant with a small record, a man previously convicted of theft, unlawful possession, or disturbing the peace, and a respectable woman whose death seemed so puzzling. Until this moment, none of his crimes had involved violence or aggression toward another person. Furthermore, there seemed to be no realistic motive for him to harm Shona Tifi. To be exhaustive in their search for the truth, the detectives decided to track down Stevens's temporary dwelling, the small, worn-out tent that he called home, and see if there was anything there that might provide additional clues or physical evidence. During their search, a team of forensic experts stumbled upon several crucial finds. Among them was a pair of pants that, after subsequent testing, turned out to carry traces of Shona's DNA, a piece of physical evidence tying him directly to the victim. Inside the small, tattered refuge, the investigators also found a price tag with a barcode from a hammer that had been purchased at a nearby supermarket just a short time before the incident. Back at police headquarters, the detectives presented this new information to Neil Stevens. They decided to use a tactic frequently used in difficult cases. They suggested to him that someone might be framing him, and that it was in his best interest to come clean and tell them everything he knew. This tactic produced a dramatic result. Instead of denying his guilt, Stevens fell silent for a moment, then nodded and began to confess. He openly admitted that he was indeed the person who attacked Shona Tifi. His confession fell from him piece by piece, a story filled with details. Yet there was a key piece missing. Detectives couldn't initially understand his motives. Why would he attack Shona in particular? What had driven him to commit this awful act? The answer to their growing number of questions came to light when the police examined Stevens's phone. Among its many contacts, there was a name that stood out: George. Detectives asked him directly who George was, and Stevens reluctantly explained that George was his friend, the firefighter, a man he knew well. This George turned out to be none other than George Tifi, Shona's own husband. Neil Stevens was the homeless man whom George had hired from time to time to do small, odd jobs around their home and garden, a person who had inadvertently become a point of conflict and controversy in their marriage. George's phone number appeared repeatedly in the call log, a total of 87 exchanges in the last month before Shona's death, adding a dramatic twist to the case. The two men had a hidden understanding. One needed money, while the other wanted to undermine his wife's happiness, creating a conspiracy forged by resentment, financial struggles, and a growing domestic crisis. This unusual alliance fell into place, piece by piece, until the true story was made clear to the investigators, a story of betrayal, weakness, and tragedy. He very skillfully manipulated the vulnerable vagrant, who literally hung on his every word. Stevens saw him as a kind of older brother, a friend, a person he could trust completely. In many ways, George Tifi filled a void in his life, someone he admired and was eager to please at any cost. Stevens openly said he idolized George, believing him to be his closest friend. someone who truly cared for him when nobody else did. This loyalty made him ready to do anything George asked of him, even something unimaginable. Then, the team of detectives turned their attention toward a crucial piece of physical evidence, the price tag from the hammer. And their subsequent inquiry revealed that it had been purchased at a nearby major retail store. This new lead opened up a path for investigators to piece together the timeline of events. They painstakingly reviewed hundreds upon hundreds of hours of surveillance camera footage, a task that seemed exhaustive and overwhelming, but their persistence eventually paid off. Finally, a breakthrough came when the investigators noticed George Teefee and Neil Stevens together in the recordings, casually shopping side by side, placing a hammer, a ski mask, and black-colored clothing into their cart. The video clearly captured their faces, smiling, talking, and looking completely at ease, a moment that would become a key piece of testimony in court. Meanwhile, Stevens continued to share his side of the story with the investigators in greater depth. According to him, George had offered him $600 to carry out the killing of his own wife, Shona, with the understanding that several $1,000s more would be handed over once George received a payout from her life insurance policy. The small burglary that had taken place just a few weeks prior was meant as a kind of trial run, a way for Stevens to familiarize himself with the layout of Shona's home and its entry points in case something went awry. George even allowed him to steal his wife's wedding ring and pawn it, adding a small financial incentive, a perverted form of a tip for a man wrestling with difficult financial struggles. Eventually, under mounting pressure, the suspect voluntarily agreed to show the police where he had buried the actual murder weapon, a heavy tool that had been used to carry out the attack. This marked a turning point in the case, adding a crucial piece of physical proof alongside the suspect's testimony. In the end, everything that the arrest of Neil Stevens revealed was more than enough to enable the arrest of George Teefee as an accomplice in this tragedy. However, instead of proceeding directly with arresting the firefighter on suspicion of conspiracy to commit murder, investigators made a somewhat unusual decision. For some reason, they first called his mother and sister and quietly informed them that George was suspected of being involved in a serious crime against Shona. This phone call, made on the 9th day after Shona's death, turned the suspect's family's world upside down. As soon as the relatives learned the bitter and painful truth, they rushed to dial George's phone number in a state of disbelief and alarm. A few minutes after this phone conversation, the team of police officers, who were already keeping George Teefee under surveillance and closely monitoring his phone, overheard his sister calling him to tell him he was now suspected of taking his wife's life. Shortly after that, George darted out of his residence, jumped into his truck, and sped away down the highway in a dramatic and desperate attempt to escape whatever fate might await him. George Teefee weaved recklessly through city streets and then turned onto Summerlin Parkway. His vehicle accelerated to a breakneck 85 miles per hour before he suddenly and violently crashed into a barrier alongside the highway. Police later described this incident as a suspected end-it-all attempt, noting that there were no skid marks, a clear sign that George hadn't tried to slow down or avoid the collision. His intent appeared to be quite deliberate. However, much to everyone's astonishment, George Teefee survived the collision. According to emergency responders, he was wearing a seatbelt, which kept him alive upon impact. He was rushed to a nearby hospital, where doctors treated his injuries, and where detectives subsequently placed him under arrest. When George was formally presented with the charges, that he was suspected of organizing the killing of Shona Teefee, he simply raised his gaze from his hospital bed, nodded quietly, and said, "Okay." Meanwhile, back at the police station, Neil Stevens was also formally charged in the killing. All of these revelations came as a shock to Shona's family, adding to their immense tragedy. Yet there was a small measure of relief. If George Teefee's suicide attempt had been successful, he might have avoided justice, adding further agony for the victim's relatives. But instead, he remained alive and would face trial alongside his accomplice. More than 3 months after their arrest, Neil Stevens chose to plead guilty to taking Shona Teefee's life. In exchange for this confession, and for agreeing not to pursue the death penalty, the prosecutor insisted that he must provide testimony against George. The main challenge was that Stevens was still fiercely loyal to George and seemed unsure whether he could bring himself to speak against him. Nevertheless, this person was quite vulnerable and easily influenced, which meant the lawyers were able to persuade him to become a key state's witness. Later, in August 2015, at the court hearing, Neil Stevens did everything he could to explain to the jury in vivid detail exactly what had happened, how he fell under George's influence, and how together they fell into a conspiracy that resulted in tragedy. The defense team fiercely challenged Stevens' entire account during cross-examination, putting forward every possible inconsistency and casting doubt upon his credibility as a key witness in the case. Big Will, who also appeared in court to provide testimony for the prosecution, was not spared from this aggressive questioning. During cross-examination, he reluctantly admitted that Stevens was not a person whose words should be trusted without careful scrutiny. This moment seemed to undermine the state's case, fueling suspicion that their principal testimony might be less reliable than first believed. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavy with doubt, the kind of doubt that could make a jury reconsider its view on a person's guilt. The main objective for the prosecutors was not just to rely on the testimony of a questionable accomplice. Their aim was to show the jury that George Teefey was fully capable of organizing and executing a brutal crime. Prosecutors presented a significant amount of incriminating evidence to help connect George Teefey directly to the conspiracy. Among the most dramatic elements were surveillance camera recordings that captured George and Stevens together as they purchased a hammer, a ski mask, and other items that, according to investigators, were meant to aid in the commission of the killing. George's defense team tried their best to downplay these recordings, arguing that there was a perfectly reasonable explanation for their purchases, insisting that the two men were simply buying tools and materials for ordinary household repairs, and that there was absolutely no sinister intent behind their actions. George remained impassive and calm, sitting quietly at the defense table without displaying a single sign of nervousness or remorse. His expression stayed perfectly composed, adding an aura of disbelief to the dramatic trial unfolding in the courtroom. After a trial that spanned an entire week, during which nearly 40 witnesses were called to the stand, alongside a staggering 400 pieces of physical evidence, the 12 jurors were left to determine George Teefey's fate. The jury, made up of individuals from various walks of life, deliberated for a total of 3 long days. Inside the courtroom, the two families sat quietly, awaiting the moment when the jury would pronounce its decision. Shona's relatives, many dressed in shades of pink, her favorite color, held hands and supported each other through the immense stress of the trial. Meanwhile, George's supporters remained firm in their disbelief, insisting that he was not involved in his wife's death and trusting that justice would be done. Finally, after extensive deliberations, the jury rendered its verdict. The moment fell heavy upon everyone present, the moment when the true character of George Teefey was forced into the light. The jury found him guilty of conspiracy to commit murder and first-degree murder, delivering a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. When the sentence was read aloud, George stood up quietly, with the very same impassive expression he had maintained from the start of the trial. Not a tremor, not a break in his mask, while Shona's family openly cried tears of justice, relief, and deep sadness for their immense and permanent loss. Nevertheless, not everyone was completely satisfied with the outcome. Some felt there were still unanswered questions, while others insisted the punishment fell short in delivering true justice. Neil Stevens, the man who physically carried out George's plans, was also convicted and received a sentence of life imprisonment with a minimum term of 42 years to be served before he could be considered for parole. His fate was a dramatic affirmation that justice had indeed been done, although many people involved in the case remained haunted by its details, wondering whether there might still be more to uncover in the tragedy that had shattered their community. On the night of April 26, 2005, Raven Abaroa returned to the quiet townhouse in Durham, North Carolina, where he lived with his wife, Janet. But instead of coming home to peace, he stepped into a scene of horror, one that would shock investigators, shake the local community, and make headlines for years. Moments later, Raven placed a panicked 911 call. The dispatcher tried to get more information, but Raven's responses were vague and confusing. He struggled to explain what had happened, often talking in circles. Emergency responders arrived quickly. Inside the home, they were met with a grim and heartbreaking sight. Paramedics made an attempt to save Janet's life, but she was already beyond help. Janet Abaroa was born on June 19, 1979, in a peaceful, scenic town nestled among the rolling hills of Virginia. She was the seventh of 10 siblings and quickly stood out for her intelligence, kindness, and strong character. From an early age, Janet exhibited traits that would stay with her throughout life. She was determined, compassionate, independent, and intellectually curious. Friends and family described her as warm and thoughtful, yet quietly confident. Janet's passion for sports was a central part of her identity. In middle school, she played soccer and basketball, and she also took to the water as a swimmer. As she got older, her dedication to sports only intensified. In high school, she continued to excel on athletic teams, and her talent eventually led her to Southern Virginia University, a small liberal arts college that shared her religious values. It was during her time playing collegiate soccer in 1998 that she met Raven Abaroa, a fellow student and athlete. He was charismatic, confident, and skilled on the field. Their connection grew from mutual respect and shared interests, and soon developed into a romantic relationship. Over time, their bond deepened, and after several years of dating, the couple chose to take the next step. In August 2000, Janet and Raven were married in a sacred ceremony at the Mormon Temple in Washington, D.C., a deeply meaningful location for the two of them, as committed members of their faith. At first, their future looked bright. They were young, driven, and shared similar hopes for a loving, faith-centered life together. But early into the marriage, cracks began to appear. Janet began opening up to her loved ones about troubling issues in their relationship. She confided that Raven's behavior had become erratic and hurtful. There were signs of infidelity, whispers of other women, unexplained absences, and long periods when he would disappear without offering any reason. When he returned, he acted as if nothing was wrong. For Janet, who had always dreamed of a loyal, supportive marriage and a home filled with love and honesty, this betrayal was deeply painful. She wanted to build a stable family, and the emotional strain of her husband's actions left her feeling disillusioned and torn. Despite the heartbreak, Janet remained conflicted. She still cared for Raven, and her religious upbringing emphasized forgiveness and the importance of keeping families together. Amid this emotional turmoil, Janet found out she was pregnant, a moment that should have been filled with joy, but instead was clouded by fear and uncertainty. She wanted nothing more than to be a devoted mother, but the thought of raising a child in an unstable relationship weighed heavily on her. Still, she chose to move forward with strength and grace, hoping that motherhood might bring new purpose, and perhaps even healing. On October 17, 2004, Janet gave birth to a son named Caden. She poured all of her love, time, and energy into being the best mother she could be. Even as financial pressures mounted and emotional tensions lingered, Janet remained focused on providing a safe, nurturing home for her child. The family relied solely on Raven's income, as Janet had stepped away from work to care for Caden full-time. Raven's job in sales brought in modest earnings, but it wasn't enough to comfortably support their growing household. Money was tight, and the couple struggled to make ends meet. Thankfully, their landlord offered them a generous 3-month extension on rent to ease the pressure. The church community provided them with some financial relief, ensuring they could afford basic needs for themselves and their infant son. Despite this support, the family's financial instability persisted. Then, in December 2004, a new and serious problem arose that added to their already heavy burdens. Raven was arrested on charges related to theft. It was discovered that he had stolen several items, mainly athletic apparel, from the sporting goods store where both he and Janet were employed. He had attempted to sell the stolen merchandise online, an act that ultimately led to his arrest. Raven was ordered to pay restitution totaling $15,000 to the store and was sentenced to 2 years of probation. The consequences of his actions were devastating. Not only did both Janet and Raven lose their jobs, but Raven's newly acquired criminal record made it nearly impossible for him to find new employment. The couple found themselves unemployed, without income, and responsible for a newborn. Despite these tremendous challenges, Janet refused to give up. She and Raven did their best to pick up the pieces of their life. They took on temporary jobs, accepted financial and emotional help from their families, and tried to keep their relationship from falling apart entirely. Still, under the surface, unresolved tensions and mistrust lingered. On April 26, 2005, the day began like many others. Janet picked up baby Caden from his daycare and returned home to prepare dinner. That evening, Raven joined them. The small family had dinner together in what appeared to be a quiet, domestic routine. Later that night, Once Janet and Caden had gone to bed, Raven claimed he drove to Morrisville to participate in an indoor soccer game, one of the few recreational outlets he still enjoyed. But when he returned home late that night, he encountered a horrifying scene that would change everything. Raven Abaroa, clearly in shock and disbelief over what he had found, immediately dialed 911. His voice on the emergency call, later reviewed by investigators, carried a mix of panic and confusion. He informed the dispatcher that his wife had been attacked and was unresponsive, but he couldn't explain exactly what had been done to her. He appeared unable, or perhaps unwilling, to articulate the severity of what he had seen. When first responders arrived at the scene, they were met with a grim and tragic sight. Paramedics quickly assessed the situation and determined that Janet Abaroa had not been harmed by a firearm, as might have initially been assumed given Raven's vague report. There was nothing the emergency team could do. The scene was secured and homicide detectives were immediately called in to take over. The investigators were stunned, not just by the loss of life, but by the sheer brutality and calculated nature of the attack. It was clear to everyone on scene that this had not been a spontaneous act or random incident. It was vicious, intimate, and personal. The immediate question on everyone's mind was the same. Who could carry out such a violent and targeted act against a woman who was known to be peaceful, loving, and well-liked by everyone who knew her? At the crime scene, investigators and forensic technicians collected a wide array of evidence. Blood patterns, fingerprints, potential DNA, and even a partial shoe print were all cataloged. On Janet's body and throughout the room where she was found, forensic experts carefully gathered materials that could help establish a timeline, reconstruct the events, and, most importantly, identify a suspect. Each piece of evidence was treated with the utmost care, knowing how critical they would be in piecing together the final moments of Janet's life. Meanwhile, law enforcement began canvassing the neighborhood, looking for possible witnesses. They asked neighbors if they had seen anything unusual that night, any unfamiliar vehicles, unfamiliar faces, or sounds of a disturbance. They also inquired about the couple's recent behavior, hoping to understand the household dynamics. But almost immediately, detectives began to focus their attention on someone very close to the victim, her husband, Raven Abaroa. As is standard in most cases of this nature, the spouse is often considered a person of interest, particularly when the crime occurs in a shared home and there are no signs of forced entry. Raven was invited to the station for a formal interview, and during multiple rounds of questioning, he provided a detailed account of his whereabouts on the night of the incident. According to his statement, he had returned home at around 8 p.m. and had dinner with Janet and their son. After dinner, he claimed that both Janet and Caden had gone to bed, and then he left the house to attend an indoor soccer game in Morrisville, a nearby town. He said he didn't return until approximately 10:40 p.m. Upon entering the home, Raven called out to his wife but received no response. That's when he went upstairs, and according to him, discovered her. When questioned about who he thought might have had a reason to harm Janet, Raven offered an unusual and unexpected theory. He suggested that perhaps the mounting financial stress the family had been under had overwhelmed his wife. He speculated, without evidence, that she may have harmed herself. He implied that she might not have been able to handle the pressures any longer. This suggestion was not only upsetting to those who knew Janet, it was also deeply inconsistent with what investigators were seeing. Family members and close friends were outraged by this theory. They categorically denied that Janet would have ever done anything to harm herself. According to them, she had never once expressed thoughts of that nature, even during the most trying times. She had a strong support system and had been candid about her marital issues, but she remained hopeful about the future. Importantly, Janet's faith played a significant role in how she viewed the sanctity of life. As a devout member of her church, she was deeply committed to her beliefs and would not have made such a choice. Furthermore, the physical evidence at the scene directly contradicted Raven's suggestion. Forensic investigators discovered a shoe print near the body, along with an unaccounted-for fingerprint. The pattern of the crime scene indicated that there had been no forced entry into the home. The doors and windows were all intact and locked, which strongly indicated that the perpetrator had either been invited into the home or had access to it already. This narrowed the field significantly. It was someone the victim knew and likely trusted. Even more suspicious was the list of items missing from the home. 2 kitchen knives from the set in the house were unaccounted for, one of which could have been the weapon used in the crime. Also missing was Raven's personal laptop. Yet nothing else of value had been disturbed. Janet's rings remained on her fingers, and all other valuable household items, jewelry, electronics, even easily pawned goods, were untouched. If robbery had been a motive, none of it made sense. That theory was quickly abandoned. Despite the growing suspicions, investigators still lacked the hard evidence required to detain Raven. So, after his initial interviews, he was released. But his behavior following the incident only deepened the concerns of those around him. Within just 24 hours of Janet's death, Raven packed up his belongings, gathered Caden, and left North Carolina for Utah. While grief affects people in different ways, many found his abrupt departure unsettling. It was understandable that he might not want to remain in the house where such a traumatic event had occurred. But what was less understandable was his complete emotional detachment. Friends and family who spoke to Raven in the days and weeks following Janet's death noted something deeply troubling. He did not appear to be grieving. According to them, Raven was not acting like a man who had just lost his wife in a horrifying and deeply personal attack. He wasn't asking questions. He wasn't pushing for updates from law enforcement. He wasn't expressing anger or sadness. In fact, he seemed eerily calm, even distant. More notably, he did not seem interested in finding out who had taken Janet's life. There were no pleas for justice, no interviews, no social media posts seeking information or answers. In stark contrast, Janet's family was relentless in their pursuit of the truth. Her parents, siblings, and close friends poured their time and energy into trying to keep the case alive. They worked closely with detectives, hoping that some new detail or breakthrough would finally point to the person responsible. They scoured through her journals, emails, and messages, hoping to find something that might help the investigation. Eventually, a new detail emerged, one that shifted the focus back to Raven once again. Investigators discovered that not long before Janet's passing, Raven had taken out a substantial life insurance policy on her. The amount was startling: $600,000. Detectives were immediately troubled by something they found both unusual and deeply telling. Although the Abaroa family had been struggling with serious financial instability for quite some time, no life insurance policies had ever been in place until shortly before Janet's death. That in itself raised questions. But what truly startled investigators was the timing of Raven Abaroa's next move. Not long after his wife's passing, and crucially, before she had even been laid to rest, Raven had already contacted the insurance company in an attempt to begin processing the claim for her policy. For investigators, this was not just premature. It was alarming. To many, it gave the impression of someone who was less focused on grieving a spouse and more concerned with collecting a financial payout. Detectives began digging deeper into Raven's past. They quickly uncovered troubling inconsistencies in the stories he had told not only to law enforcement, but also to Janet herself. During their courtship, Raven had portrayed himself as a devout member of their shared faith, saying he had once traveled to Peru as a missionary for the church. This detail was completely fabricated. In fact, Raven had never served a mission abroad, something that is typically a significant milestone in the life of a faithful Mormon man. While these lies did not directly tie him to the crime, they painted a portrait of someone who was comfortable with deception and manipulation, even in intimate relationships. Following Janet's passing, Raven relocated from North Carolina to Salt Lake City, Utah. He settled into a quiet life with his son Caden, and on the surface, appeared to be attempting a fresh start. With insurance money now reportedly in hand, Raven no longer faced the same financial pressures. While living in Utah, he met a new woman named Vanessa Pond, a caring, soft-spoken kindergarten teacher. Their paths crossed when Raven enrolled his son in her class, and their connection was almost immediate. Soon, they began dating, and their relationship developed quickly. But what Raven didn't know was that Janet's family had not stopped paying attention. They remained deeply committed to uncovering the truth, and that included keeping tabs on Raven's new life. The family, still in mourning and desperate for answers, reached out to Vanessa. In an effort to protect another innocent woman, they warned her about Raven's past. They told her that he was not the man he seemed to be, and they urged her to be cautious. But Vanessa, caught up in the early days of love and trust, didn't believe them. She stood by Raven, convinced that the accusations were exaggerated or the result of misunderstanding and grief. Over time, however, cracks began to show in their relationship. After 3 years of dating, Vanessa and Raven married. But soon after the wedding, she began to witness a different side of him. Just like in his first marriage, there were episodes of volatility. Vanessa described Raven's frequent mood swings, bursts of anger, and controlling behavior. At times, he would lose his temper over seemingly minor things, and she started to feel unsafe. She later admitted that she began to question everything, especially whether it was truly possible that her husband had been involved in his first wife's death. While Raven attempted to present himself as cooperative and open, his behavior increasingly raised concerns. He made an unusual choice by giving an interview to the media, where he stated publicly that he hoped the case would be resolved soon, so that the police would finally leave him alone. He denied any involvement in Janet's death, but showed little emotion when discussing her memory or the tragedy that had unfolded. To those watching, it seemed as if he wanted to shift attention away from himself, while doing little to honor the woman he had lost. Around this time, a new detective took over the case, someone determined to approach the investigation with fresh eyes and unwavering focus. This new lead investigator was deeply committed to uncovering the truth and giving Janet's loved ones the justice they had been waiting for. Her family, still grieving yet relentless in their pursuit of answers, offered full cooperation. They handed over Janet's journals, emails, and communications, and kept in regular contact with the investigative team. Meanwhile, Vanessa was quietly coming to her own realization. The man she had married was not the kind, grieving widower he had portrayed himself to be. She eventually came forward and spoke to the media herself, describing her own troubling experiences. She revealed that Raven often displayed erratic behavior and emotional instability. Over time, she began to believe that he was not only manipulative, but possibly capable of serious harm. Detectives began reconstructing the full timeline of the events leading up to Janet's death. They believed firmly that Raven was responsible, but proving it was another matter. One of the biggest hurdles they faced was his alibi. Multiple individuals had confirmed that they saw Raven at the indoor soccer game on the night of the incident. These witness statements complicated the case significantly, and prosecutors were reluctant to move forward without airtight evidence. Still, the investigators pressed on. They closely examined the 911 call Raven had made on the night of the tragedy. During the call, he told the dispatcher that his wife had been shot, which was quickly proven incorrect. Janet had suffered stab wounds, something that was visually evident even to untrained responders. While some might chalk this up to confusion or shock, detectives believed this was an intentional misdirection, a tactic to delay or mislead the investigation. As part of a renewed investigative strategy, detectives arranged a follow-up call with Raven. In this phone conversation, they subtly introduced new questions and revisited old ones. Raven repeated the same basic story he had told years earlier, but this time, he struggled even more to recall certain key details. His inability to remember the timeline, combined with vague accusations that police were incompetent, only deepened their suspicions. Wanting to learn more about his character, investigators also reached out to another woman Raven had dated. The responses were startlingly consistent. Several former partners confirmed that he had demonstrated aggressive behavior, controlling tendencies, and emotional manipulation during their relationships. One detail in particular caught the attention of detectives. On the night of Janet's death, Raven had locked his dog in the garage, a behavior that friends and family said was completely out of the ordinary for him. As investigators continued to re-examine every thread of evidence in the tragic case of Janet Abaroa's death, they uncovered yet another disturbing detail that seemed to suggest premeditation. It was revealed that just one day prior to the incident, Raven Abaroa had taken deliberate steps to transfer data from his personal laptop to another storage medium. This transfer raised serious questions for detectives. On February 1st, 2010, nearly 5 years after Janet's death, Raven Abaroa was formally arrested on suspicion of first-degree murder. He was apprehended and extradited back to North Carolina to face charges. As preparations for the trial began, detectives resumed combing through earlier forensic findings. It was then that a seemingly small but significant detail caught the attention of one of the lead investigators. On the bedside table near Janet was an open contact lens case, empty. Her parents later told police that she had a specific nightly routine. She never went to bed wearing her contact lenses. To explore this question further, forensic analysts revisited Janet, and in July 2010, 5 years after her death, they discovered what appeared to be the dried, deteriorated remnants of contact lenses still on her eyes. The experts confirmed that Janet had indeed been wearing contact lenses at the time of her death. By 2013, the case was ready to go to trial. Raven Abaroa would finally stand before a judge and jury in a courtroom that was packed with media. The prosecution, understanding the limits of their physical evidence, leaned heavily on the volume and consistency of circumstantial facts, but the defense fought back. In their opening arguments, they sought to redirect attention by pointing to alleged flaws in the initial police investigation. They argued that from the very beginning, law enforcement had narrowed its focus on Raven and had failed to thoroughly explore alternative suspects. They pointed to evidence such as a mysterious fingerprint found on a closet door that did not match either Janet or Raven. These items, the defense claimed, had been neglected or dismissed too quickly. They argued that the prosecution had rushed to fit a theory around Raven without exhaustively pursuing other possibilities. Furthermore, they filed a motion to delay or dismiss the trial, arguing that the character portrayals of both the victim and the accused had been incomplete. That motion was surprisingly granted, and the trial was temporarily halted and rescheduled for March 2014. By the time the next phase of the trial arrived, a major shift had taken place. After nearly a decade of denying any involvement and maintaining his innocence, Raven made a strategic legal decision. He entered into a plea agreement with the prosecution. As part of the deal, Raven Abaroa pleaded guilty, not to first-degree murder, but to the lesser charge of voluntary manslaughter. This marked a significant turn in the case. Under the terms of the plea, Raven was sentenced to 10 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after serving 8 years.